My name is Carl McQueary. I'm an historian, a cultural historian, have been for a very long time. I became involved with the Watson house many, many years ago. 2005? Somewhere in there, in the early 2000s. My friend Jean Williams Barak, if you're an old Austinite, that's important. Jean Williams Barak, her uncle was Theo Williams. Anyway, I became involved with Bob Garrett through Jean Barak, who sent me over to Bob because Bob needed what we refer to as a placer. Bob had acquired certain items through his life that he wanted to sell, but he didn't want anyone to know, and he didn't want to dirty his hands with the transaction, and so that's what a placer does. And so he had several really wonderful things that I was to place. And that was simple enough, and the job was quickly done. And then Bob and I became very good friends over the course of the next 5 or 6 years. I worked with Bob quite extensively, and we'll get into that story, but I worked with him very extensively. I knew him in a very different capacity, probably than most of his friends and associates did. Bob was a rather serious person. The public front was very serious, and in the world where he traveled, that was kind of necessary. But I got to know him very, very well through initially placing some of his artifacts to various people and places. And so we became very close, and eventually I was like, Bob, you've got to get out of this house. The chateau was Xanadu, incredibly grand, incredibly important in the city, but toward the end of the time he was there, it was not a healthy place necessarily at all for Bob. And he had a lot of chest problems, a lot of breathing problems, respiratory, and aggravated by the fact that, well, the chateau was 150 years old by that point, and the accumulated dust and just life in the chateau made it a little hard for Bob. And at first he was like, oh no, I'm fine, it's great, it's terrific, don't you worry about it. But eventually it became very clear that that was not the case. And so finally in the summer of 2009, on the 50th anniversary of Bob moving in, that's kind of important. They moved in 59, rented it for a little bit, and then eventually Bob and Arthur moved in the home. Well, I'm an estate liquidator and have been for a long time for kind of the carriage trade, if you will. So I told Bob, I said, Bob, we've got to have an estate sale. We've got to get you out of here. And so finally one day it stuck, and he realized, it's probably time, Carl. So we gathered him up, and Bob did an inventory, as only Bob could do, being the decorator that he was, interior designer, of the furniture that would fit in the new place he was going, a condo over in North Austin. And so he did this kind of amazing 1, 2, 3 boom. He said, I want this and this and this and this and this needs to go, and those drapes. Whoosh. We moved, and of course it was perfect. The trouble with the chateau, not really the trouble, but just the reality of the chateau is it's isolated. The driveway is horrible. There's no parking. So trying to do a public sale would not have worked, plus the publicity. We didn't really want everyone to know what was going on. Bob was a very private person at the end of the day. He was a very private person. And so basically through special contacts, private appointments, and that kind of thing, we cleared the chateau. The chateau was not your normal estate sale homestead. All right. So these photographs they trigger a lot of memories. So for example, there's Arthur and Bob sitting in front of the fireplace. And when I did the sale, that's exactly how it looked. This was probably 35, 40 years ago. And so all of the things on the fireplace, the art, everything. If you've not experienced the chateau, it's something. It's really kind of amazing. And these photographs kind of tell you what it was like. The chateau was unlike any home in Austin. That's very safe to say. Arthur had bought it in 1959 when he had begun dating Bob. And so these photographs kind of show you, it's fairly remarkable what they did. They transformed it from an old house on 18th and Red River into this place that's hard to describe. Everything was still there, but they transformed the home. The dining room was especially incredible. No bigger than a postage stamp, but you can do a lot in the postage stamp size room. You can see these, just the candelabra, the candlesticks, the table settings. Everything was remarkable, because Arthur was decorator to the stars, as was Bob to a lesser degree, but they had all the big contracts with all the big families, because the families all knew Arthur and they knew Bob through Arthur. And so if you wanted your place decorated, that's who you called. There was various strata in Austin in those days, and if you were of a certain strata, Arthur Watson was your man. Watson Associates Decorating was your guy, and that's who you called. But Arthur did the big game. He got the UT clients, the UT Regents Home, the Littlefield Mansion, all of Frank Irwin's personal things. He was good friends with Frank Irwin. Anyway, he really had the trade, the decorating trade, and so that's how how the chateau came to be. They had a greenhouse, which you can't really tell from this photograph, but it was a greenhouse with a little room built in for entertaining. They grew orchids and all manner of amazing things. When I first met Bob, he was still on the tail end of that decorating. And then here, these little formal paths with the things on the outside of the house. There's the house. Very formal, little, perfectly finished, perfectly done, bricks from France. That's on top of the garage, the lower garage. There was the upper garage and the lower garage. The lower garage was a treasure house. 45 years of decorating. That was kind of their studio, workspace, that kind of thing, where the bigger things would come, waiting a new home or whatever. And a lot of them had remained. So to look at these photographs, this was during its prime, when the chateau was picture perfect. This statue here is McQueary, and he stood at the end of the pool. The pool was basically carved out of limestone. It's an incredible pool, and of course, during its heyday, served as kind of the center point for a lot of society, a lot of the gay society especially. The LBGT thing, when you're rich as hell, being gay really doesn't matter. In fact, you wanted your decorator to be gay. There you go. And so famous folks, Rock Hudson, Pavarotti, a lot of people, when they would perform at Frank Irwin, would come over for the after party to Bob and Arthur's home. You can tell from these photographs, it's a very big, grand home condensed down to a very small space. The rooms in the chateau are minuscule. They're very, very small. There's not a big room in the whole house. But the way it was done and staged, with the scale of the furniture, the decor, the fabrics, the pillows, the lamps, it was incredible. In 2009 is the day that Bob said, okay, that's enough, let's do it. And we got him set up in his new place. He was doing everything there. It was beautiful. Had Fortuny drapes cut down from the chateau to fit the new place. In fact, the dining room was papered, well, fabricated, if you will. The walls were done in Fortuny fabric, which I got to cut down with a paring knife around the edge, because he was going to leave them, and I was like, oh no, we'll take care of it. Clearing the chateau, that was a highlight in the estate world. For me, for the people who were fortunate enough to be invited to purchase the things. Kind of the end of an era, if you will. But Bob went to his new place and was tickled pink. He never looked back. He never missed it. In fact, when you'd ask him about it, he'd like, oh, the old house, Bob, whatever. Let's talk about what's happening now. He was not stuck in the past. He was very current. Arthur was the friend you want, because when you traveled, he knew which berth or which cabin you wanted that wasn't over the engine. He knew the stewards. He could get you whatever drink you wanted at 3 a.m. He could do anything you wanted. kind of a fairy godmother in many ways when Arthur was on the case. Anything you wanted, no problems, no suffering.
Did they really travel with their dogs?
Oh, they traveled with their dogs. Huge, beautiful, incredible Afghan hounds and poodles and just every kind of dog. You can't leave without Bobo. Bobo's got to go. So Arthur passed in the 90s. They had lived very hard, and his health had declined severely. So when he was in the hospital there at the end, I did not know them then, but Bob, through Bob's telling, I kind of knew them. So when Arthur died, Bob was lost for a time, because Arthur had kind of driven the ship, driven the bus, driven their little minivan, their giant motorhome, little tiny Vixen. The Vixen, by the way, had Fortuny drapes too, and was beautifully fitted. And even after Arthur was gone, Bob continued to use that for a time. So I was Bob's friend. I was a state liquidator. I started out as this placer. Placer's an old term of art, but that's what you do. You go and place objects with other people. In my experience, I never knew Arthur personally. But when you process an estate, because in addition to being a cultural historian, I'm kind of an archivist too. In addition to the estate liquidation, it's kind of a nice way they all fit together. And so in processing it, I kind of process it as an archivist, with an archivist's eye. So I know Arthur. I know him really well. Remarkable individual. Just the stories and the places and the experiences that he did. He was a tremendous sharer. If he was having a good time, he was going to make sure you dadgum had a good time too. And being the host, they both were. Arthur was a host, Bob was a hostess who also cooked. Of course, Arthur cooked too, in that little minuscule galley kitchen of the chateau, which is no bigger than a minute. It's incredibly small. Was remodeled, they gained another 1.5 feet in the 64 remodeling, and then on and on. But it's a very small place. They could entertain 100 people out of there. And that's what they did, because that was one of the things, not only for the business, make your clients happy, get new clients, etc., but just for people. And their whole life together was formed around entertaining, taking care of other people. Arthur took very good care of Bob. Very good care of Bob. But Bob was, I don't want to say the little woman, but the spouse. Bob took very good care of Arthur too, with his clothing and his food and just everything required to keep the great man going. Bob was there. Bob was a giving, funny man. He encountered a little resistance when he first appeared on the scene, because Arthur had his big circle of people that he ran with. And then suddenly Bob is on the scene, and they're all kind of like, who is this yokel? And it took Bob many years to kind of break into that circle. And Bob kind of wore a chip on his shoulder because of that. I think that's fair. But eventually he did win most everyone over, and they all saw that Bob was pretty great, but it took years. Bob was basically at every party I did for 10 or 12 years. I mean, every party. In his Austrian jacket, he would come in and hold court on the sofa. And people would literally jockey for position to be interviewed or talk to Bob. And they didn't really know who he was necessarily. But he was so courtly and so regal. And sometimes he wore a cravat, with his Austrian jacket. He had place. And people would fight to kind of sit with him and talk with him. Well, toward the end, Bob's memory went, and it was harder. It was difficult. Because there was a time when he didn't really necessarily, he knew who I was, but that's about it. And that was very, very difficult for both of us. I was very, very fortunate to know Bob as I knew Bob. Uh, I still think of his stories and just the stuff, and it's a delight. It's just keeps me going. Since I've started this project with you, I've looked around the house and I'm like, oh my word, that's from the chateau, that's from the chateau, that's from the chateau. It's kind of incredible that I have Bob with me. If you've never been to the chateau, which most people in this world have not, it used to be kind of a freestanding place with other houses and things next to it. And then urban renewal came in the 60s and basically determined that all the houses and things around the chateau were crap. But the chateau was spared the destruction, which frankly is kind of a miracle. Had Frank Irwin not said, leave that one alone, I'm certain it would be gone. And Bob was pretty certain too. But knowing Frank Irwin in those days was a good thing. The house, the chateau, needs to be saved for many reasons. Not because it was my good friend Bob's house, but because it's one of the oldest homes in Austin. And it is a remarkable little structure. Of course, I can't even imagine what shape it's in now. That's kind of heartbreaking too. Anyway, but I would like to see it saved. It could be a guest house. It could be a wonderful place for architecture students to meet, like the architectural whatever the hell. There's a lot of things that could be done with it. And its location on campus is pretty primo. Yeah, it's all a matter of convincing the right person. It should be saved. There's no reason it should not. It's a historical gem, first of all. Second of all, its place in history. Third of all, just what it represents. It was the center point, and I can say this with great authority, the center point upon which LGBT society rotated. And even the non-LGBT society, it was a party central. It was the meeting place. It was well known. Yeah, there's 100 reasons, more than, to save the chateau. There's a book, Vagabond House. That's the name of the story, Vagabond House. And it talks about how when he grows up, he wants to have a house. And he describes the house in very specific terms, what he wants to do. And he goes all the way through. And then at the end, he talks about the door knocker, and he talks about various details. Then at the end he says, I would have built this house, but I'm just a wanderer. It talks about the details of the house he wanted to build. Well, letter and verse, it's the chateau. It's the chateau. And so when we were doing the clean out and everything, Bob was like, take everything, leave nothing behind. So all the fixtures, all the fittings, even the dumb things, including the door knocker, which I have, a little imp, which is described in this book. They have no relation, no actual relation, but it's kind of incredible when you go down the list and read the book and then just what was in the chateau. The chateau was magic. There's no way to describe it. It was environments. Each room was kind of fitted and finished to produce an effect. And it was beautifully done. Even though by the time I saw it, it had faded slightly. But the things and the custom furniture and the fabrics and the wall coverings, there was nothing else like it in Austin. I say there's probably still not.